The stagecoach rattled into Sioux Falls, South Dakota on a blistering afternoon in July of 1878, carrying 5 passengers and one woman who had not uttered a single word in 3 weeks. Florence Vance sat rigid against the worn leather seat, her hazel eyes staring straight ahead at nothing, her fingers clutching a faded shawl despite the oppressive heat. The other passengers had tried speaking to her during the journey from Omaha, offering water, conversation, and sympathy, but she remained locked in her silence, trapped somewhere deep inside herself where words had lost all meaning. Gideon Ward watched from the boardwalk outside the general store as the stage rolled to a stop, dust billowing around the wheels like prairie smoke. He had come into town for supplies, not expecting anything more interesting than choosing between 2 brands of coffee, but something about the woman who emerged from that coach made him pause. She moved like someone sleepwalking through a nightmare, carefully placing one foot in front of the other, guided by the stagecoach driver who seemed uncertain whether to offer his arm or simply point her toward the hotel. The driver, a grizzled man named Hutchins whom Gideon knew from previous trips to town, caught his eye and walked over after helping Florence retrieve a single worn carpet bag from the luggage boot. Hutchins shook his head slowly, speaking low enough that the woman could not hear. She got on in Omaha 3 weeks back. Hasn't spoken a word the entire journey. Station master there said she'd been brought in by some cavalry soldiers who found her wandering near Fort Kearney. Something terrible happened, that much is clear, but nobody knows what. She had a ticket to Sioux Falls tucked in her dress pocket, so we brought her here like the ticket said. Gideon looked past Hutchins to where Florence stood motionless in the street, still clutching her carpet bag, seemingly unsure what to do next. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and several townspeople were starting to gather, their curiosity piqued by the strange, silent woman who had arrived on the stage. "She have family here?" Gideon asked. "Don't know. Like I said, she hasn't spoken. Can't answer questions if you don't talk." Hutchins wiped sweat from his brow with a dusty handkerchief. "I suppose someone should take her to Mrs. Donnelly's boarding house. Can't just leave her standing in the street." Before Gideon could respond, Florence's knees buckled slightly, and he was moving instinctively, crossing the dusty street in long strides. He caught her elbow gently just as she swayed, steadying her without speaking, without demanding anything from her. Up close, he could see the hollowness in her cheeks, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her body trembled despite the summer heat. Whatever had happened to her had carved something essential away, leaving behind this fragile shell. He did not ask if she was all right. He did not pepper her with questions or demand explanations. Instead, Gideon simply stood beside her, his hand light on her elbow, waiting. The crowd that had gathered began to whisper among themselves, but he ignored them, focused entirely on the woman who seemed to be fighting just to remain standing. After a long moment, Florence turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his for just a second before darting away. It was enough. Gideon gently took the carpet bag from her white-knuckled grip and gestured down the street toward Mrs. Donnelly's boarding house. He started walking slowly, and after a heartbeat of hesitation, Florence followed. Mrs. Donnelly was a kind-hearted widow who had been running the boarding house for 15 years, taking in travelers, workers, and anyone else who needed a clean bed and hot meals. She took one look at Florence standing mutely in her parlor and immediately ushered her upstairs to a room facing the back garden, asking no questions, demanding no explanations. Gideon waited downstairs, and when Mrs. Donnelly returned, she fixed him with a knowing look. "That girl has seen something awful," Mrs. Donnelly said quietly, smoothing her apron. I have seen that look before, back during the war. Some wounds do not show on the outside. Can you look after her? Gideon asked, already reaching for his wallet. I will cover her room and board for the month, longer if needed. Mrs. Donnelly waved away his money for the moment, though her expression softened. You are a good man, Gideon Ward, but that girl does not need charity as much as she needs time and patience. Something tells me you are planning to provide both. Gideon could not have explained why he felt compelled to help this stranger, only that walking away felt impossible. He left money with Mrs. Donnelly to cover Florence's immediate needs and headed back to his ranch 10 miles outside of town. But his thoughts stayed fixed on the haunted woman with hazel eyes who had forgotten how to speak. 3 days passed before Gideon returned to Sioux Falls. He told himself he needed more supplies, that he had legitimate business in town, but the truth was simpler and more complicated than that. He needed to know if Florence was all right, needed to see if any light had returned to those empty eyes. Mrs. Donnelly met him at the door with a concerned expression. She barely eats, the older woman confided. She sits in her room or sometimes in the back garden, but she has not spoken a word. Dr. Morrison came by yesterday to check on her, but she would not let him examine her. Just shrank away whenever he came too close. Poor dear. Gideon found Florence sitting on a wooden bench in Mrs. Donnelly's garden, surrounded by blooming roses and buzzing honeybees. She wore the same faded dress she had arrived in, her dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, her hands folded in her lap. She did not look up when he approached, did not acknowledge his presence in any way. He could have spoken, could have introduced himself properly, could have asked the 100 questions that surely everyone else had already tried. Instead, Gideon simply sat down on the other end of the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them, and said nothing at all. The silence stretched out, broken only by the drowsy hum of insects and the distant sounds of town life beyond the garden walls. Gideon sat still, his hat resting on his knee, his eyes on the roses rather than on Florence. He did not stare at her, did not watch her like some curiosity, just sat beside her in the summer heat and let the quiet exist without trying to fill it. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Eventually, Mrs. Donnelly called from the house that she had lemonade if anyone wanted some. Gideon stood, tipped his hat to Florence even though she was not looking, and went inside. He thanked Mrs. Donnelly for the lemonade, finished it slowly while discussing the weather and the upcoming church social, then headed back to his ranch. 2 days later, he came back to town. Again, he found Florence in the garden, and again, he sat beside her in silence. This time he stayed for an hour, not speaking, not demanding, just being present. When he left, he thought he saw her eyes flick toward him for just a moment, but he could not be sure. This became his pattern. Every few days, Gideon would ride into Sioux Falls, take care of whatever business needed attending to, and then spend time sitting quietly beside Florence Vance in Mrs. Donnelly's garden. He never pushed, never asked questions, never tried to coax words from her. He simply sat, sometimes whittling a piece of wood, sometimes just watching the clouds drift across the endless prairie sky. The townspeople noticed, of course. In a place like Sioux Falls, everything got noticed and discussed. Some thought Gideon was wasting his time. Others found it touching. A few whispered that he must have ulterior motives, though those whispers died quickly when Mrs. Donnelly fiercely defended his character. Gideon paid no attention to any of it. The opinions of others mattered far less than the woman who sat beside him in silence, slowly, imperceptibly beginning to relax. 3 weeks after Florence's arrival, something changed. Gideon was sitting on the bench, carving a small bird from a piece of pine, when he felt her shift slightly. She was looking at his hands, watching the knife move surely through the wood, revealing the shape hidden inside. He continued working, not commenting on her attention, letting her watch if she wanted to. When the bird was finished, he held it up to examine his work, then set it gently on the bench between them before standing to leave. As he walked away, he heard the softest sound behind him, barely louder than breathing. It might have been nothing. It might have been the beginning of something. The next time he came, Florence was holding the wooden bird, her fingers tracing the carved feathers with something like wonder in her eyes. Gideon sat down and began carving another piece of wood, this time shaping it into a prairie flower. The silence between them felt different now, less empty, more comfortable. When he finished the flower and placed it beside her, her fingers brushed his for just a second, so brief it might have been accidental, but it was contact nonetheless. August arrived with thunderstorms that rolled across the Dakota plains like artillery barrages, shaking the earth and splitting the sky with lightning. On one particularly stormy afternoon, Gideon arrived at the boarding house to find Florence not in the garden but in the parlor, sitting rigidly in a chair, her face pale, her whole body trembling. "Mrs." Donnelly whispered that the thunder seemed to terrify her, sent her into these shaking fits where she could barely breathe. Without hesitation, Gideon sat down in the chair nearest to Florence, not touching her but close enough that she could feel his presence. When the next thunderclap shook the house, he began talking, his voice low and steady, telling her about his ranch, about the horses he raised, about the way the grass looked when the wind moved through it like waves on an ocean. He talked about his childhood in Missouri, about coming west after the war, about building a life with his own hands on land that stretched forever in all directions. He did not ask her to respond. He just filled the space with words, with stories, with the sound of a human voice that demanded nothing but offered everything. And slowly, gradually, Florence's trembling eased, her breathing steadied, her fingers unclenched from the arms of the chair. When the storm passed and Gideon fell silent, Florence turned her head and looked directly at him for the first time. Really looked at him, seeing him rather than staring through him. Her lips parted as if she might speak, but no words came. Instead, the faintest ghost of something like gratitude flickered across her face. After that day, something shifted between them. The silence remained, but it was no longer the silence of absence. It became a language of its own, spoken in small gestures and shared presence. Gideon continued his visits, and Florence began to respond in tiny ways. She would nod when he arrived, or lift her hand slightly in greeting. Once, she even smiled when he showed her a particularly proud horse he had ridden into town. "Mrs." Donnelly pulled Gideon aside one evening in late August and told him that Florence had started eating more, that some color had returned to her cheeks, that she had even begun helping in the kitchen, communicating through gestures and nods. "You are reaching her," Mrs. Donnelly said firmly. "Whatever happened to that girl, you are helping her find her way back." But Gideon knew it was not about him reaching her. It was about giving her space to reach back when and if she was ready. He was not trying to fix her or save her or heal her. He was simply there, steady and patient, asking nothing, offering quiet companionship while she fought her way through whatever darkness had swallowed her voice. In early September, as the prairie grass turned golden and the air took on the first hints of autumn crispness, Gideon invited Florence to ride out to his ranch. He did it through gesture, miming riding a horse and pointing toward the open country beyond town, his eyebrows raised in question. She hesitated, fear and uncertainty warring across her face, but then, to his surprise, she nodded. Mrs. Donnelly fussed over the arrangement, insisting that she would come along as chaperone despite the fact that Florence had not spoken a word of objection. Gideon agreed easily, and the three of them rode out in his wagon on a brilliant Sunday morning when the sky seemed impossibly blue and endless. The ranch was modest but well kept, a sturdy house with a wide porch, a barn that smelled of hay and horses, corrals where a dozen fine animals grazed peacefully. Gideon had built most of it himself over the past 8 years, and the pride he took in his work showed in every straight fence post and tight roof shingle. Florence climbed down from the wagon and stood still, taking it all in. The openness of the land seemed to call to something in her, and for the first time since anyone had known her, she walked forward of her own volition, moving toward the corral where a beautiful chestnut mare stood watching with intelligent eyes. Gideon followed at a distance, giving her room. Florence reached the fence and stopped, her hands gripping the top rail. The mare approached cautiously, and Florence extended one trembling hand. The horse sniffed her fingers, then nuzzled her palm gently, and something in Florence's rigid posture cracked. Her shoulders shook, and tears began streaming down her face, silent sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken inside her. Gideon was beside her in an instant, not touching her but close, his presence a solid anchor while she cried. Mrs. Donnelly stood back, wisely giving them space. Florence wept for a long time, years of held-back grief and terror pouring out in those silent tears, and Gideon just stood there, steady and sure, letting her feel whatever she needed to feel. When the storm of tears finally subsided, Florence wiped her face with shaking hands and turned to look at Gideon. Her lips moved, forming words that had no sound, and he saw her frustration when nothing came out. He shook his head gently, his expression kind. "You do not have to speak," he said quietly. "Not until you are ready, not until the words want to come." Something in his face, in his absolute acceptance, made Florence's eyes fill with fresh tears, but these were different. These were not tears of anguish, but of relief, of being seen and accepted exactly as she was, broken pieces and all. They spent the afternoon at the ranch, Mrs. Donnelly napping on the porch while Gideon showed Florence around the property. He introduced her to each of his horses, told her their names and personalities, let her feed them handfuls of oats from the feed barrel. She moved through it all like someone waking from a long sleep, her eyes gradually taking in more, seeing more, connecting more with the world around her. When they returned to town that evening, Florence did something that surprised everyone. When Gideon helped her down from the wagon, she did not immediately pull away. Instead, she stood there for a moment, her small hand still in his larger one, and squeezed gently before letting go. It was acknowledgement, connection, gratitude, and something more, all compressed into that brief touch. The visits continued, but now Florence began riding out to the ranch regularly, sometimes with Mrs. Donnelly, sometimes with other women from town who had befriended her, and eventually, as fall deepened into October, occasionally alone. The townspeople had grown accustomed to her silence, and several families had reached out, including her in quilting circles and church gatherings where she was welcomed without expectation. Gideon learned to read her expressions, the tiny shifts in her face that communicated volumes without words. He learned that she liked morning better than evening, that horses calmed her in ways people sometimes could not, that thunderstorms still frightened her, but less so when she was in the barn surrounded by the peaceful presence of animals. He learned that she had a sense of humor, expressed in the sparkle of her eyes or the quirk of her lips when something amused her. And slowly, without either of them quite realizing when it happened, Gideon fell in love. It was there in the way his heart lifted when he saw her walking up the path to his ranch, in the way he found himself thinking about her when he should have been focused on work, in the way her rare smiles felt like sunshine breaking through clouds. He did not speak of it, did not burden her with expectations or demands. His feelings were his own to carry, and he would wait, however long it took, for her to find her own way through the darkness. In late October, as the first frost touched the prairie grass, Gideon was working in the barn when Florence arrived on the mare he had begun letting her ride, a gentle creature named Rosie. He looked up, surprised, as she dismounted and walked toward him with unusual determination in her stride. She stopped a few feet away, her hands twisting nervously in her skirt, and he saw that she was struggling with something, some internal battle that played across her features. He set down the bridle he had been mending and gave her his full attention, waiting. Florence's mouth opened and closed several times, her frustration visible, her eyes beginning to shine with unshed tears. Gideon took a step forward, then stopped himself, letting her work through whatever she needed to work through. And then, so quietly he almost missed it, a sound emerged. Not a word, just a small noise, but it was intentional. It was her voice, and it was the first sound she had made in nearly 5 months. "It is all right," Gideon said gently. "There is no rush." Florence shook her head, her determination hardening. She tried again, and this time a whisper emerged, broken and rough from disuse, but unmistakably a word. "Thank." She stopped, swallowed, tried again. "Thank you." The words were barely audible, cracked and painful sounding, but they were there, they were real, and they were for him. Gideon felt something tighten in his chest, pride and joy and tenderness all mixed together. He smiled, and it was the warmest, most genuine smile Florence had ever seen. "You are welcome," he replied simply, not making a big production of her speech, not overwhelming her with reaction. Just accepting her words the way he had accepted her silence, with patience and grace. Florence took a shaky breath, and more words came, slow and halting but increasingly clear. "You sat with me when I could not speak. You never pushed." "I would sit with you forever if that was what you needed," Gideon said honestly. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she was smiling too, a real smile that transformed her face, bringing back the beauty that trauma had hidden. "I was not sure I would ever speak again," she whispered. "I was not sure I wanted to." Words felt dangerous, like they could hurt me. Gideon moved closer slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wanted. "What happened, Florence? You do not have to tell me, but if you want to, I am listening." Florence wrapped her arms around herself, her eyes distant, seeing something far away and terrible. "I was traveling to Sioux Falls with my brother," she began, her voice stronger now, though still quiet. "We were coming to start a new life. Our parents died last year and we sold the farm in Iowa. We were going to open a shop here, a place that sold books and papers. My brother William loved to read." She paused and Gideon waited, his heart already aching for what he knew was coming. "We were attacked," Florence continued, the words spilling faster now, like a dam breaking. "Outlaws, 4 of them. They wanted our wagon, our money, everything. William tried to fight them off. He told me to run, to hide. I did. I ran into the tall grass and hid while they killed him. I heard the gunshots, I heard him scream. And I hid like a coward while my brother died trying to protect me." "You are not a coward," Gideon said firmly. "You survived. That took courage." Florence shook her head violently. "I could not scream, could not call for help. My voice just stopped, like something broke inside me. The soldiers found me 2 days later, still hiding in the grass, and I could not tell them what happened. Could not speak at all. They found William's body, found the wagon burned, and I could not even speak his name." Gideon closed the remaining distance between them and very gently took her hands in his. "You are speaking now. You honored his memory by surviving, by healing, by finding your way back. He would be proud of you." Florence looked up at him, and in her eyes, Gideon saw not just grief but something else, something that made his breath catch. "You helped me find my way back," she said softly. "You sat with me in the silence and made it safe. You did not need me to be anything other than what I was. I saw you, Florence. Not the trauma, not the silence. I saw you, and you are remarkable." The space between them felt charged, full of unspoken things that suddenly demanded to be said. Florence lifted one hand and placed it gently against Gideon's chest, over his heart. "I think I started healing the day you first sat beside me," she whispered. "I think my heart recognized yours before my mind could." Gideon covered her hand with his, holding it there. "I have been in love with you for weeks," he confessed. "I did not say anything because I did not want to add pressure, did not want you to feel obligated. But since we are speaking truths now, you should know. I love you, Florence Vance." Her smile was radiant, chasing away the shadows that had lived in her face for so long. "I love you too, Gideon Ward. I think I have for a while, but I was too lost to recognize it. You were the light I followed out of the darkness." He kissed her then, gentle and careful, a kiss that held all the patience and tenderness of the past months, all the words they had not needed to say, all the healing that had happened in the spaces between silence and sound. Florence kissed him back, her arms sliding around his neck, and for the first time since her world had shattered, she felt whole. They stood in that barn for a long time, holding each other, speaking in whispers and kisses, making up for lost time and lost words. When they finally emerged, the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and gold across the prairie sky, and everything felt new and full of possibility. The next weeks were a revelation. Florence moved from Mrs. Donnelly's boarding house to the ranch, though she insisted on Mrs. Donnelly staying with them as chaperone until a proper wedding could be arranged. The older woman agreed with twinkling eyes, delighted to see the romance blooming between two people she cared for deeply. Florence's voice grew stronger every day. She talked about William, keeping his memory alive with stories of their childhood, their dreams, their plans. She cried sometimes, but the tears were healthy now, part of grieving rather than being trapped in trauma. She talked about the books she wanted to sell, the shop she still dreamed of opening, and Gideon supported every dream, every plan. In November, they were married in the small church in Sioux Falls, surrounded by the community that had embraced Florence and respected Gideon. She wore a simple but beautiful dress that Mrs. Donnelly and other women had helped her sew, and she carried a bouquet of the last autumn wildflowers Gideon had gathered from the prairie. When the preacher asked if she took Gideon as her husband, Florence's "I do" rang clear and strong, and there was not a dry eye in the church. They honeymooned at the ranch, which felt more like home to Florence than anywhere had since she lost her family. Gideon was gentle and patient, treating her like precious cargo, and their wedding night was tender and sweet, a joining not just of bodies but of souls that had found each other in the darkness and chosen the light together. Winter arrived with characteristic Dakota brutality, bringing snow that piled high and winds that howled like wolves. But inside the ranch house, there was only warmth. Florence threw herself into her new life with enthusiasm, learning to manage a household, helping with the horses, filling the house with laughter and conversation that had been absent when Gideon lived alone. They talked for hours, making up for those months of silence. Florence learned about Gideon's past, about the family he had lost to fever, about his dreams of building something lasting on the prairie. Gideon learned about Florence's childhood in Iowa, about her love of literature, about the thousand small details that made her who she was. In the spring of 1879, Florence opened her bookshop in Sioux Falls, fulfilling the dream she had shared with William. She named it Ward and Vance Books in honor of both her brother's memory and her new life with Gideon. The shop was small but well-stocked, and it quickly became a gathering place for the community, somewhere people could browse, read, and discuss ideas. Gideon helped her run the shop when ranch duties allowed, and the sight of the tall cowboy carefully shelving books or discussing literature with customers became a familiar and beloved one in town. He was proud of his wife, proud of her strength and resilience, proud of how far she had come from the silent, broken woman who had arrived on that stage coach the previous July. That summer, Florence discovered she was pregnant. The news brought joy mixed with trepidation, old fears about loss and vulnerability rising up, but Gideon was there, steady and sure, reminding her that they would face everything together. Mrs. Donnelly fussed over her like a mother hen, and the women of Sioux Falls rallied around her with advice, hand-me-down baby clothes, and unwavering support. In February of 1880, during another brutal Dakota winter, Florence gave birth to a healthy baby boy they named William Gideon Ward. She wept as she held him, tears of joy and grief intertwined, mourning the brother who would never meet his nephew while celebrating the new life they had created. Gideon held them both, his family, his heart so full he thought it might burst. Fatherhood suited Gideon. He was patient and gentle with his son. The same qualities that had helped Florence heal now applied to raising a child. Young William thrived, growing strong and healthy, filling the ranch house with laughter and chaos. Florence bloomed in motherhood, though she never gave up the bookshop, dividing her time between business and family with impressive skill. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Catherine Rose Ward, named for Gideon's mother. Catherine had her mother's hazel eyes and her father's steady temperament, and she was doted on by her older brother and both parents. The house that had once been so quiet now rang with children's laughter, and Gideon often paused in his work to simply marvel at how his life had changed. The bookshop prospered, becoming more than just a business but a community institution. Florence held reading groups, sold papers and writing supplies, and became known as someone who would listen to anyone who needed an ear. She never forgot what it felt like to be voiceless, and she made sure that everyone who entered her shop felt heard. On quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the prairie wind whispered across the grass, Gideon and Florence would sit on their porch, her hand in his, and remember. They remembered the silence that had brought them together, the patience that had healed her, the love that had grown in the spaces between words. They talked about William, keeping his memory alive for the nephew and niece who would never meet him but would know his story. "You ever regret it?" Florence asked one summer night in 1885, when they had been married 6 years and life had settled into comfortable rhythms. "Do you ever wish you had chosen an easier path, a woman without so much baggage?" Gideon turned to her, his eyes serious and full of love. "I have never regretted a single moment. You were never baggage, Florence. You were a treasure waiting to be discovered, a gift that I did not know I needed until I found you. Sitting beside you in that garden, waiting for you to be ready, those were some of the most important moments of my life." Florence kissed him, slow and sweet. "You saved me," she whispered. "No," Gideon corrected gently. "You saved yourself. I just sat beside you while you did the hard work." She smiled against his lips. "Then let us say we saved each other, because before I met you I was lost. And I think maybe you were lonely, even if you did not realize it. We found each other right when we both needed it most." Gideon could not argue with that. Life before Florence seemed distant and faded, like a dream half remembered. His real life, his true life, had begun the day he sat down beside a silent, traumatized woman and simply waited for her to be ready. The years continued to pass, bringing the normal joys and challenges of life. The ranch prospered, the bookshop thrived, and the children grew. Young William showed an aptitude for working with horses, while Catherine proved to be a voracious reader with her mother's love of books. In 1887, they had another son, Thomas, who was born laughing and never seemed to stop. Gideon and Florence grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year, their bond strengthened by everything they had overcome. The community of Sioux Falls watched their story with fondness, pointing to them as an example of true partnership and devotion. Young couples sought their advice, and they always gave it freely, emphasizing patience, respect, and the importance of really listening to each other. Florence never forgot the darkness she had endured, but she also never let it define her. She used her experience to help others, quietly supporting women who came to town with haunted eyes and broken spirits, showing them through her own example that healing was possible, that life could be good again, that love could be found even in the aftermath of trauma. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1889, Gideon took Florence back to Mrs. Donnelly's garden, to the bench where he had first sat beside her in silence. The garden had grown more lush over the years, and Mrs. Donnelly, now in her 70s but still sharp and energetic, had maintained it beautifully. They sat together on that bench, their 3 children playing nearby under Mrs. Donnelly's watchful eye, and they remembered. They remembered the silence, the patience, the slow healing, and the love that had grown from the quietest of beginnings. "If I could go back and tell that broken woman on the stagecoach what was coming," Florence said softly, "I would tell her to hold on. I would tell her that a man with kind eyes was going to sit beside her and wait, and that waiting would change everything. I would tell her that life was going to be beautiful again." Gideon wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "If I could go back and tell that lonely cowboy watching the stage arrive what was about to happen, I would tell him that he was about to meet the love of his life. I would tell him that patience and silence could speak louder than words. I would tell him that every moment of waiting would be worth it." They sat in comfortable silence, just as they had 11 years before, but this silence was different. It was not empty or frightened or broken. It was full, rich, comfortable, the silence of 2 people who knew each other so completely that words were optional, a gift rather than a requirement. Young William ran up, breathless and laughing, asking if they could go see the horses at Papa's ranch. Catherine and Thomas followed, equally enthusiastic, and the moment of reflection passed as family life reasserted itself with joyful chaos. As they walked back through the streets of Sioux Falls, their children running ahead, Gideon took Florence's hand and squeezed gently. She squeezed back, that simple gesture communicating everything they needed to say. They had built a good life together, a life full of love and laughter, children and community, purpose and partnership. The trauma that had stolen Florence's voice all those years ago had not disappeared, but it had been transformed, integrated, healed. She carried the memory of her brother William always, but now alongside that grief lived joy, hope, and a deep, abiding love for the man who had sat beside her in silence until she was ready to speak. And Gideon, who had once been content with his solitary life on the prairie, now could not imagine existence without Florence and the family they had created together. She had brought color and sound and life to his world, filling spaces he had not known were empty. The years rolled on, bringing all the changes that time inevitably brings. The children grew into young adults with their own dreams and paths. Young William eventually took over management of the ranch, showing the same patience and skill with horses that his father had demonstrated. Catherine went to Chicago for university, came back with a degree and a passion for education, and opened a school in Sioux Falls. Thomas followed his mother's love of books and eventually expanded the shop, turning it into one of the finest bookstores in the Dakota Territory. Through it all, Gideon and Florence remained each other's anchor, each other's refuge, each other's home. They grew old together gracefully, their hair turning silver, their faces gaining lines, but their love never diminishing. If anything, it grew stronger, deepened by decades of shared experience and unwavering devotion. In 1903, on a warm summer evening, they celebrated their 24th wedding anniversary surrounded by their children, their grandchildren, and half the town of Sioux Falls. It was a joyous celebration, filled with food and music and stories, and Gideon and Florence danced together under the stars the way they had on their wedding night, moving slowly to music only they could hear. "I would do it all again," Florence whispered as they swayed together. "Every moment of pain, every second of fear, all of it if it meant ending up here with you." "You will never have to do it again," Gideon promised. "Whatever comes, we face it together. That is what we do, that is who we are." And that was the truth that sustained them through all the remaining years they were granted together. When illness came, they nursed each other. When grief visited, as it inevitably does in a long life, they comforted each other. When joy arrived, they celebrated together. They were partners in the truest sense, two people who had found each other at the exact right moment and built something beautiful from the broken pieces. In their later years, young people from all over came to hear their story, fascinated by the romance that had begun in silence and grown into legend. Florence would tell about arriving in Sioux Falls traumatized and voiceless, and Gideon would tell about choosing to sit beside her without demands or expectations. Together, they would talk about patience, about listening, about giving someone the space they need to heal while still showing up consistently to walk beside them. "Love is not always loud," Florence would say. "Sometimes the most powerful love is quiet. It is showing up. It is being present. It is waiting for someone to be ready without ever making them feel rushed or inadequate." "And when you find someone worth waiting for," Gideon would add, "you wait, however long it takes. Because that kind of love, the kind that is built on respect and patience and true seeing, that is the kind that lasts forever." Their story became part of Sioux Falls history, passed down through generations, a reminder that healing takes time, that love requires patience, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is simply sit beside them in silence until they are ready to speak. Gideon Ward lived to the age of 74, passing peacefully in his sleep in the ranch house he had built with his own hands, surrounded by the family he had created with Florence. His funeral was attended by hundreds, a testament to the impact he had made on his community through his quiet strength and unwavering kindness. Florence lived another 7 years, continuing to run the bookshop with Thomas's help, continuing to be a pillar of the community, continuing to share her story with anyone who needed to hear that healing was possible. She missed Gideon every day, but she carried him in her heart, in her memories, in the life they had built together. When Florence passed away at the age of 79 in 1910, she was buried beside Gideon in the cemetery overlooking the prairie they had both loved. Her gravestone, placed there by her children, reads simply, "Florence Vance Ward. She found her voice and used it to help others find theirs." At her funeral, William stood and shared his mother's story one last time, telling of the silent woman who arrived in Sioux Falls and the patient cowboy who sat beside her. He told of their love, their partnership, their family, and their legacy. He reminded everyone gathered that his parents had taught him the most important lesson of his life. True love is patient, true love is kind, and true love waits for the person to be ready without ever giving up on them. The story of Gideon and Florence became legend in Sioux Falls, a tale passed down through generations about the power of patience and the healing that can happen when someone chooses to sit beside you in silence until you are ready to speak. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried their legacy forward, embodying the values of kindness, patience, and unwavering support that had defined their love story. The bookshop remained in the family for generations, a living memorial to Florence's dream and the life she had rebuilt from trauma. The ranch continued to produce fine horses, carrying on Gideon's work and his approach of patient, respectful training. And on quiet evenings, family members would gather on the porch of that ranch house and tell stories about the great love that had started in silence and grown into something that changed countless lives. Because in the end, that is what the best love stories do. They do not just change the people directly involved. They ripple outward, touching everyone they encounter, inspiring others to be more patient, more kind, more willing to sit beside someone in their darkness and wait for them to find their way back to the light. Gideon and Florence's story was one of those rare love stories that transcends the individuals involved and becomes something larger, something universal. It reminded people that trauma does not have to be the end of the story, that healing is possible, that love can be found even in the aftermath of terrible things, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give another person is simply your presence, your patience, and your willingness to wait for them to be ready. Their love had started with silence, but it had created a symphony that echoed through the generations, a beautiful reminder that the best things in life are worth waiting for, and that true love does not demand. It simply waits, steady and sure, until the beloved is ready to step forward into the light together.